Thank you, thank you. All right. I think we've had enough action for one day. Let's just talk in a monotone for about 3 hours. All right, so since we have a conflict of interest, I'm going to try to make everyone happy, which probably means that no one will be happy, but I'm going to go through these compasses quick because most of the information is available, and then we'll spend most of the time working on the next couple steps of the lock and talking about the design of the lock. So I'm just going to do the forgings and a quick assembly, no finish work, no pinning, but you'll get a quick idea of the forging. So I've got some 3/8 square. Is this bolted down? Yeah. All right.
I think the support cords underneath need to be going this way because this one is not in line. So that if we can lift the anvil, let's see, we need to probably have to loosen those lag screws and put them that way because this one's out of position.
All right, well, we'll just leave it as it is.
Okay.
How's that? Suppose we just leave it as it is. All right, so while the fire's settling in, this small forging will help the fire settle in. We just lit the fire, so it's a little cold yet. So I'll make the single leaf first, and I'm going to step or shoulder here and then here. So this is an exercise in thinking in 2 different planes. Oh, maybe I can do it this way. So can you guys see better? So that's a half face blow. I don't know if the camera can see that. Boy, you can't see that. So that was the first step, half face blow, and the second step is hammer lined up with the anvil edge. What's that? Yeah, almost, but a little different. All right, so, can you pick this up?
Yes.
Or you're not on the monitor? All right, how about this?
you get too close, I can't focus on you. Go away.
That's not the first time. All right, so I have, this was the half face blow shoulder, and this was the both at once shoulder. Let's see, how about there? Can you focus there? All right. So I have one single-sided shoulder and one double-sided shoulder. All right. One single side, one double side. Okay, one more heat and we'll have that. All right. Now, I don't know, I think these compasses were designed around a very important principle, which is if you take the square bar that's used for this leg and you flatten it out, it makes the perfect starting bar for the other leg. So all compasses have to have that inherent relationship. Here I can, let me do it this way. Okay, that's the perfect starting bar for the other leg. The square bar flattened out.
And that just has the one shoulder on it? Or was that intentional?
Well, I need 4.5 inches of this for this size.
Peter, are these typically made from wrought iron, or would they try to make them out of steel?
I think most of these used to be made of wrought iron. They were for carpenters and other woodworkers, so they were just for marking wood. The really good ones had steel points, but probably the vast tens and tens of thousands of them were just iron. Yep, just enough. All right, so using that really critical rule, which is cut it off the bar as soon as you can. Boy, it's dry out here. My hammer handle needs one. Is that what you soak them in? All right, so now I'm going to do 2 single shoulders. All right, can you get a good close-up of that? So a single shoulder on this side, and, well, the shoulder was done here. Can you get any, can't get any closer than that?
Not maxed out.
That's there, all right. Well, single shoulder here, single shoulder here. All right, that's 1. That's 2.
Are the 2 shoulders about equal? Equal in length? Oh, no, not at all. Okay.
So if you get this far, well, all you need to do is make the book match of this. Which sounds, how hard could that be? But yeah, that's the hard part, is to make the book match of that. So you're not going to do the same thing on the other end. You're going to do the mirror image of it. So I made the first shoulder. Then which way did I have the bar? Anyone remember which way I had the bar angled when I did the second one? Right, left? What? I don't know what that means.
Your second one was sitting that way?
The first angle about 4 o'clock.
You mean that way, the way I'm looking at it, or the way you're looking at it? Yeah. Yeah, well, you were pointing towards
Oh,
that
sorry about
door,
that.
so I didn't know what you meant.
Okay.
But yeah. So, all right, so the first side was angled this way. So the book match, here's the first one, was done here. So the book match is going to happen here, which is always a little awkward. Okay, so can you focus any better?
Hold it dead in front of you, dead right in front of you, so that yes.
It's still out of focus. Which way are you? There we go. All right. Now the real people can see it. All right, so it's from the center line, it's the same mirror image both ways. All right. It's a really simple shape until you try to make it. And as you can see, it takes lots of precise measurement and very sophisticated tooling. Don't try to do this at your own shop unless you have at least this much equipment. You don't want to get halfway through this procedure and find you've run out of the right tool. So you need another one. I forgot. You need another one. You need one of these. That rules out a lot of shops. Okay, so now we're going to cut it somewhere where we think it'll fold in half. And luckily for everyone, this didn't fold in half. So if you notice, one leg is shorter than the other. You'll have to take the camera will have to take my word for it. So one leg is shorter than the other, which is not ideal. So rather than scrap this whole thing, start again, I'm going to fix it in a very easy way. And I'm going to use a characteristic that most of the time you think is a failing of the material, but in this instance is an advantage. And that characteristic is that when you have something on the anvil and you hit just one edge without the edge that's up that you're hitting stretches more than the edge that's resting on the anvil. Everyone knows that's a horrible characteristic in forging, except when you want it to happen. So now I want it to happen. So I'm just going to put the short one up. First I have to figure out which the short one is. That's the hard part. All right, now they're the same. I don't know if you can you get in there? All right, so I just stretched the short one a little.
Back up, you're out of focus.
All right, so when I think about these characteristics of iron, rather than think, oh, this is a bad thing, or you just think, well, that's a characteristic. Sometimes you don't want it to happen. You figure out why it happens. You can avoid it happening. Sometimes you do want it to happen, and you know automatically what does make it happen. So stretching one edge and not the other can be a good thing. All right, is there some borax around? Some flux? Whoa. There's about this much in here.
You want a can?
No, I'm gonna
Yes.
get into the box a little. Oh, there it all is. I'll try not to use it all. There it is. Thank you. All right. So, as you can see, I'm following all the prescribed fluxing procedures. I took it out of the fire. I've wire brushed the hell out of it twice. Put it back in the fire, took it out again, wire brushed it again, fluxed it all over the edge of the forge, so at least as much flux went on the forge as in the seam. And disturbed the fire, finally put it back, rebuilt the fire, and now we're ready to weld. So I sort of like to streamline that procedure a little by fluxing it right in the fire and welding it. So it's a good thing there weren't many books about this when I was starting, because I would have developed all kinds of habits that I knew were correct. Let's see. Since this anvil is so far away, I think I'm going to stand over here. take one more heat. So I've just, well, I beat on it a little bit. I don't know how to tell you how much or how little. I have a little too much material. And a big split, so we'll just take another.
Say it's splitting. Peter, did you say that it was splitting?
Yeah.
So you're just going to reflux and
Yep,
get it back together?
I hope so.
Yeah, that's what I would hope.
Ugh. Well, I think I'm making a Damascus. I'm making a Damascus twist out of this. Well, you'll just have to take the theory. All right, so this will never be a good one, but it will serve as a good example. All right.
What's the fault that you see?
It's got a big split down the middle of the leg. So the middle of the leg never welded. So, and I couldn't get it to weld again. So we'll let those cool, and then a little filing, and I'll show you how they're fit together. So we'll come back to that in a few minutes. So any questions about these forgings at this point?
Hey, you called it a compass, and I would have called it a divider. Are they both the same?
Depends on what period of usage you want to refer to. In the 18th century, these were always called compasses. And they're listed that way in all the catalogs and all the people's letters and diaries and store inventories. A divider back then, I believe, was a tool like this that was a one piece with a spring in the middle and a wing nut to adjust. So they were a one piece rather than hinged. You know, they were a sprung tool rather than a hinged tool. And some fine drafting tools were called dividers too. But this kind of a tool with a pinned joint was always called a compass. And I don't know when the terminology changed, but I think it was probably during the 20th century. Now, no one, if I say compass to someone, no one knows what I mean. So they think I mean a tool that'll help me find my way in the woods, yeah.
I think of one with a point on one side and a writing utensil, a pencil or a pen
Yeah.
On the other side.
Yeah. But the tips had nothing to do with the terminology originally. It was how the thing opened and closed. All right, so any other questions?
Do you sometimes put that in a die to make it half round or half triangular cross section on the legs?
Yeah, if I'm going to make one of these with a half round leg, then I would put it in a open faced bottom die to forge that. And the Cooper's compasses that have a triangular leg have a V bottom die to set it in. So you want to forge the final shape. You may not be able to forge the whole thing cleanly, but you don't want to start with a rectangle and file it to a half round. You want to be able to forge the thing pretty closely to final shape. So that would be one more heat for each leg. I would still point it first, then I would take another heat and forge it into the die to form it half round on the outside.
How highly do you set the rivet in there? Do you countersink the rivet at all?
There are two joints here. This one is a flat joint where the rivet does not extend above the surface of the joint. And in this case, you have to countersink the leaves, or the rivet has nothing to squeeze against. So in this flat joint, or rule joint as it's called, the hole through the joint is countersunk on both sides, and the rivet is peened flush with the surrounding surface. So it's only the little flange of the countersink that's squeezing the joint together.
How tightly do you take the rivet?
Tight enough so that they hold their setting. I don't, did you want an answer in pounds per square inch? Or? If you do, you're going to be waiting a long time. I have no idea. So this other compass has a rivet that stands proud of the leaf surface. So the bulge of the head on this one is the rivet head on both sides.
That's not a washer.
No, it's just a big rivet head. Yeah. So some of them have washers, bigger compasses that have a big something at the head do use a washer.
So you're smushing a pin to make the head
Yeah.
on both sides and then doing
Yeah.
your file work with it.
Right.
Now, did you ever punch that hole?
I have tried punching these holes hot, and I've never been able to make a clean enough hole to make these work. So I don't know what compass makers did in 1780. That's one of the biggest mysteries for me about making these in terms of historic practice. How did they make the hole for the rivet?
Now, they had brace and bits or
Sure.
some kind of drill press.
Oh yeah.
So you just were trying to see
Well,
do it both ways.
well, if you could do it by punching, it would be 10% of the time of drilling. If they had figured out how to punch it, I'm sure that would have been the standard procedure because it would be much, much faster.
Punching ream.
Well, it's not that the hole doesn't come out round, but when you punch all three layers at once. You have to punch them while they're assembled, or you never get the hole to line up. And what happens is the top two layers suck down into the third. And so the hole looks clean on the end, it's round, but you no longer have a smooth moving joint because of the rag from the other layers binds in the one below. So I have punched heavier material hot. When I make fireplace tongs, it's 3/4 inch thick, and so you have 3/4 inch thick layers. We punch that hot without any trouble. But punching 3 layers that are 3/32 thick, I haven't been able to do. Doesn't mean they didn't do that, but I haven't been able to do it. So that one's still unsolved.
What happens if you're setting the rivet and you find you've seized the piece?
Well, you can always work it open. Well, you can almost always work it open. If you have to, you can heat it up again. And that'll loosen the rivet that's too tight. All right. We'll let those sit for a few minutes. Let's talk about locks. All right. All right. So while no one was looking, I snuck ahead on this lock that I started yesterday. So I forged a bolt last night, and I'll forge another one this afternoon. But this one has been filed so that it fits. Now it fits the lock, and it runs on a little track that's riveted in place also. So you can pass this around. And you'll see that the bolt is thick where it extends out of the case, but inside the case it's thin, which allows a lot of parts to be positioned underneath the bolt. So let's look under the bolt in this lock. Just for, let's see. Let's just make this one a little easier to think about. I'm going to take out the latch mechanism. So let's just think about the bolt for now. All right, so this bolt is the same deadbolt design as the one that's coming around. All right. And it has a little different track because this is a 3-bolt lock and that's a single bolt lock. But it operates by the key fitting in that notch and throwing the bolt back and forth. All right? That's pretty easy to understand. All right? If the question was, do these need lubrication? And normally they don't. Normally they're designed to run dry. So all the sliding surfaces are filed really smooth. All right, so here I've thrown the deadbolt and I take out the key. What's to stop the credit card owner from getting in this door? There's nothing visible on the bolt that's keeping it from sliding. The key didn't have any trouble sliding it back and forth. Well, by the same token, let's say the bolt is retracted and someone slams the door. What's to keep the centrifugal force from throwing the bolt out of the lock before it gets to the jam? How come it can't come out either? So that's the other mechanism in this lock, is the thing that locks the bolt, the deadbolt, in either its retracted or extended position. And that is what's hidden under the bolt. So let's do a really fancy shot for the camera, and we'll peel away. Geraldo Rivera will open the magic tomb and expose the secret works. All right, so here under the bolt, and I'll use the key to make it move. That is the lock, and that part is called a tumbler, which is a confusing term because this is not a tumbler in the sense of modern tumbler locks at all. But this part had that name before the design of modern tumbler locks. All right, so how does the tumbler do its job? The tumbler has a little talon that sticks out, and the bolt has a talon that sticks in. And so in one position, the talons are like this. When the key works, it moves the tumbler out of the way and then back into position behind the talon on the bolt. So that's what's happening in this lock. So now that you know that, let me pass this around. I'll try not to get it too grubby. So what the key does is two things. It lifts the tumbler which allows the bolt to slide. Then it slides the bolt, and then it lets the tumbler down again. It does those two things.
So you have to continue to turn the key to pull it out.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just making the tumbler go, okay, so you put it in, turn it all the way 360. Pull
Yeah,
it out.
yeah,
You put it in and go all the way the other way.
right. Yeah, it's magic. It can't possibly be done with crude tools, I can tell you. So there's a spring on the tumbler, so the tumbler is positive, and the spring has to be strong enough so that you can mount that lock right side up or upside down, and there's still enough force to make the tumbler work. You can't rely on gravity. So that's what's making the snap action in the lock, is the spring on the tumbler. The bolt is just free to slide either way, like the bolt in this one that's going around. All right, so let's make a bolt, because we've got nothing else to do. Well, I'm going to make the material. It's mild steel. It's just a flat bar, and I'm going to...
So are you starting with 316?
Well, I'd like to, but what I have is 1/4 inch. So I'm going to reduce it to 3/16 under that thing first. So it'll take me a heat or two to get the right material to start making this bolt. So we're just going to make an arbitrary bolt. It's not going to fit any of these locks necessarily, but
Part of that spring up around the blades, or is it riveted?
I'm sorry, say again?
On the spring, you have part of that, is that raised up here, or is it riveted up where it's not moving?
The tumbler spring.
The tumbler spring is riveted through the case.
You're looking at paint's covered.
Right. Well, that's because I know how to file. So the spring when you forge the spring, you forge a shape like that, and this little tab gets put through a slot in the case and peened over on the outside. And in fact, most of the other parts in the lock are fastened to the case that way also. All right, let's start making the bolt. One more. Well, let's see. I think that should do it actually. All right, so there's the setup for the bolt. That doesn't focus any better than that. All right, so it's just, by doing this, you can make the thick end of the bolt with just light tools.
Peter, how much is left at the thickened section? How long is that to go out and slide into the keeper of the board?
Well, I'm going to, once I get this welded, then I'll draw out the tail. Is that what you mean?
Well, you've got the part you just stacked up. How long does that need to be so that it's still encased in the case that can slide back and forth into the door keeper?
So yeah, so how long does this big beefy section of the bolt need to be? It needs that, and the bolt moves, or the amount that the bolt moves, we call the throw. And the throw is normally the height of the bit of the key. If I remember right. So if that's the key hole, that's the throw.
And is there a little bit more so it
Yeah, it's got to stick inside the case, maybe another 1/4 of an inch. I think I'm remembering right. It's been so long since I've had to talk about this. All right. Well, let's see. Why don't we measure? We can measure the throw on that lock and see how that compares to the key.
Yeah, well, I don't know the exact number. Oh, yeah.
So I'm going to weld next, so it should come out this way. Take one more heat and dress it up a little bit. All right, so this lock is a little different from the 3-bolt lock. This lock has a guide for the bolt, and that sets the throw. That's the throw. It has a limit of travel in both directions. So in the middle of the throw, the notch for the key should be straight over the keyhole. And the same with this 3-bolt lock. Oops. We'll make a smaller bolt out of this. Well, I thought those tongs would hold it, but let's find a better pair. All right, you see what I just did? A simple offset. That makes sense? Now we can stretch it a little. All right, so this is most of the bolt forged. This will be the same style bolt as there is in that 3-bolt lock. one of the things I think is pretty typical of old work is they don't go back and forth between the fire and the vise. So you have some kind of a system for completing the forging before any filing starts. And once you start filing, you don't heat the thing up again, because you're redoing your efforts. If you file it and then you heat it up again, you have to refile it. You have to refile the same spot you already did. So we want to make sure that we have a forging that will make the finished bolt. All right, so that's pretty close. Now, if I was in an 18th century workshop, I would know the next step to do on this is to start filing. Well, there's one more step. Maybe let's talk about that. But essentially, the way this gets finished is by filing. So there's no sense in leaving it too thick or too rough or too long, because it's just the penalty is more effort. Not more safety, but more punishment.
Did the same guys usually file that forged, or did it usually just go down a line?
I think it depended. If it was the same guy that did the forging and filing, probably depended on how big the workshop was. And there were people called lock filers. And I think in the bigger shops, they were separated.
How do you know that there was a guy named Jack Smith and a lock filer? Is it from their wage books and stuff like that?
There's, how do we know any of this? There's a pretty good book that was written in 1747 called The London Tradesman. And the London Tradesman was sort of the equivalent of a college guide for parents. And it described about 200 different trades that you would find around London and what kind of aptitude it took to practice those trades and what kind of wages you would make. So if you're thinking of finding the right trade for your son to apprentice into, this could give you some idea of the advantages of one over another, or disadvantages. And there are some trades that are described as demanding great ingenuity, and there are other trades that are described as demanding no ingenuity, and there everything in between. And so that book lists jacksmiths and locksmiths and 15 other kinds of iron workers as the normal kind of specialty trades you would find in a bigger city, as well as all the woodworking trades and textiles, house construction, all of those things. So that's one of the sources we use, is the London Tradesman.
Can you still get that on Amazon?
You can, yeah. Oh yeah, that's been reprinted. So yeah, you can, you know, before supper you can buy up probably half the available stock in America. No, I just got another copy not too long ago. So I think the author's name is Campbell, but the London Tradesman is, and then other kind of clues come to light. So for example, there was we found 4 pages, or one of the researchers did, 4 pages from an account book from a shop in Norfolk from about 1785, and the guy called himself a shovel and spade maker. And he was billing one of his customers, and there were, you know, 52 dozen of this kind and 12 dozen of this kind, and so that's the guess, is that's what he did. He made shovels and spades and had a shop that just did that. So you wouldn't call that man a blacksmith. He wasn't a blacksmith. The terms meant what kinds of work you did for a living, not what kind of metal, but if you made guns, you're not a blacksmith, you're a gunsmith. If you made locks, you're not a blacksmith, you're a locksmith. And so the term blacksmith meant mostly a small local shop that did repairs and some custom work, but not manufacturing. So there wasn't a single object that blacksmiths would normally make. So they needed some generic way to describe that. The blacksmith is the absence of a specific product.
Did the term smith then, from my knowledge, come from the word smite?
I think so.
Smite,
I think so. I think.
which was an English
Yeah,
version of it.
I think so. Anyone know?
It is
They sound alike, so they must have been it.
English for
Why smite?
Smite?
I mean, I've always heard the word smite, like, to smite somebody.
Yeah.
And that's bad, right?
Hit. It's only bad if it's the wrong person.
Okay.
Some people deserve smiting.
Smited.
Well, and of course, you know, when you first see the love of your life, you have been smitten.
Right. Okay.
So it's not all bad.
Okay. Well, I can accept this.
And after you're married, she might spit you up.
You might be smitten in return. Smote.
Smite or the smitey.
All right. So the same London Tradesman describes it says in the larger smiths shops in London, the workmen are divided into 3 classes. They are the fireman, the hammerman, and the viceman. And he describes what each one is responsible for, and then he gives the wages for each one. Different wages for the fireman. The fireman is tending the fire and holding the work, guiding the work. The hammerman we would call a striker, and the viceman is a filer. So who gets paid the least?
Fireman, striker.
Okay, who gets paid the least?
Fireman.
Okay, who gets paid the least?
Hammerman.
The hammerman, the striker. Yeah, that's just some mindless dummy, right? Well, anyway, the striker got paid the least. Who was in the middle?
Fireman.
The fireman, the smith, and the viceman was paid the most. And he explains why.
I've got plenty of vices. I gotta make.
What's that?
I got plenty of vices. I should.
Well, ask for more money.
That's one of his vices.
Yeah, so the vice man got paid the most because, as Campbell says, he has the ability to spoil everyone else's work or enhance it. He can take an irregular forging and turn it into something good, or he can take good work and leave it looking crude. So he has the last say over how everything comes out, and if he spoils it, he's wasted the work that's gone into it so far. So he had the most responsibility and got paid the most. So the filers were not, that wasn't just grunt labor. They were the important in a shop like that.
Was that division of labor reflected in Williamsburg in 1770?
Well, so part of what Campbell says is telling, which is in the larger shops you can afford to specialize. In the smaller businesses you can't. If you only have 2 people in your shop, you can't have 3 classes of workmen.
But did you notice that in the Williamsburg?
There's no way to tell from the records of one individual shop how they divided up the work. In fact, if you take any one shop in Williamsburg, let's say you take the shop that James Anderson operated, we know at times he had 7 or 8 people working for him. So if you see a piece that you know was made in James Anderson's shop, who made it?
Probably his guys.
There's no way to know. Absolutely no way to know. If you see, if I look out the window and I see a Ford, I know the Ford family responsible for that. Who actually made the car? There's no way for you to tell by looking at it just because it says Ford on it, even if you know what plant it was in. Who touched that thing? So knowing what shop these objects came out of doesn't tell you who made it. And it doesn't tell you who did what part of it. That is gone forever. In fact, if you look at a piece that came out of the James Anderson shop in Williamsburg between 1785 and 1790, when I was there, that's within our lifetime, you still can't tell who made it. How are we ever going to know about something 250 years ago?
Like on that lock, you stamped it. Did you see that historically?
Oh, sure. Yeah, the owner gets his name on it. Mr. Ford has his name on that thing. He didn't.
Same thing. Okay.
Same thing. Yeah, just because there's a name on the object doesn't mean that person made it or ever even saw it. Now, here's another interesting thing. In the English tool business, tool manufacturing business, there were businesses that were retailers, like, well, there's a really famous one named Peter Stubbs. So they were in Birmingham, I think, or Prescott. Anyway, Peter Stubbs, you can still find Stubbs marked files and little hand vices and pliers, all kinds of things that were made for watchmakers and clockmakers. Well, Stubbs Company, I think, only ever made files in-house. So they bought pliers and hand vices and all the other hundreds of small tools from local manufacturers. They bought pliers from pliers makers and vice makers and screw plate makers and all the other little tools they carried. So Stubbs, well, these pliers makers had a Stubbs mark in their shop, and when they were making pliers for Stubbs, they stamped them Stubbs, and when they were making pliers for Wick and Green, they stamped them Wick and Green. So the manufacturers had maker's marks for all the different retailers that they were supplying. So even if it's marked Stubbs, it doesn't mean it was ever made anywhere near the Stubbs factory. And this was common 200, 300 years ago.
Still is common.
Still is common, yeah, yeah. And so it's easy to romanticize something from the past and say, oh, this is marked with James Anderson's name. I can just imagine him sweating over the anvil making it. And look, this is where he burned his thumb, you know, and this is where he dropped the thing on his toe. It's a wonderful story, and that's where it should remain. So in the making of locks, which were pretty standardized things, you have often the same scenario. You have parts makers, you have locksmiths, they're all buying and selling parts from each other. And I think still some shops demanded better quality, they tried to hire better workmen, they might have paid better wages for that. And even if they were all working to produce the same basic design goods, it didn't mean they were all exactly the same. Just like all the different car makers don't make exactly the same quality, even though they're all basically a four-wheeled thing with an engine and seats for the same number of people and windows. It's the same general concept, but there are variations from one maker to another.
Is there a rare find name on a lock that, say, if you took it to Antiques Roadshow, they would say, we've never seen one of these before? Very rare.
Usually the locks that start to be signed are not from this era, but the one following, where people start patenting their own design inventions.
What would be a name to look for if you were looking for a rare piece?
Well, the first two guys that patented lever locks, which are different than these, were Barron and Chubb. They're both English makers, and you can find Chubb locks, but some of those companies continued in business for 100 years. They still mark them Chubb. So you can find a Chubb or Barron lock. It doesn't guarantee it's a very early one.
Yeah, unless you see file marks or some identifying.
That doesn't guarantee anything. Well, except it does guarantee something. It guarantees someone filed on that part. That's all you can conclude. You don't know how old it is. There are a lot of English workmen still using 18th century methods right up until the 1950s and 60s. Yeah. Kind of confuses the picture. Jaguar, yeah, Rolls-Royce. Yeah. Well, those weren't really 18th century methods. They were maybe 1880s methods. All right, so there's one more feature to this bolt that has to be done before the filing commences. And what's that? The notch. Exactly. So, all right, so we have a left and a right here. Locks, we have a left and a right, but we can envision the whole procedure here. So let's cut the notch, because that's kind of an interesting, that goes pretty quick. It's a nice, and then all the forging, all the heating will be done. You cut the notch, bend the talon, and then this can go into the other room, never to come back. You don't want to ever see it again, probably, by the time you've made 8,000 of these. All right, so let me get my notch cutter. So here's the notch cutter, just a thin chisel. Got it? Well, it's just, how much film do you need on the chisel anyway? All right, so, well, maybe we should cut the notch in this one because this is a real thing. It's been filed and we'll spoil that a little bit, but then whoever bids on this lock tonight is really they'll have something. They won't have as much guessing to do. You'll know you won't screw up the bolt by cutting your own notch in the wrong place. So let's do that. All right, so a lot of lock work is done by really simple layout, not by great math. Can you guys see in here? Suppose I do it this way. Can you guys see? Well, all right. Well, I'll just draw in chalk. That'll be easier to see. All right, so, well, I can't do that. So I'm going to mark, I've just marked the throw. And I'm going to mark halfway between those, roughly. All right, so that's thrown halfway. So the center of the notch should be centered over the keyhole. All right, and you can see how incredibly precise this is. Oh, I need another tool. Here, I'll let the camera glean everything from this. Pardon me for just a second. Yeah. So I have a cold chisel, and this is one of the few times where I ever mark the location for a chisel cut. I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
A little sleight of hand there that you had marked the position on the exposed side of the bolt and you
Turned it over?
turned it over.
Yeah, I just transferred the mark around.
Okay. Missed that.
Yeah, so I had the mark, and all I did was do that. Let's see if this will, yeah. Hold it. All right, so you can see when you make these cuts how it bows the bolt. So it always does that. So before you do anything, you can just forge this back flat. Sorry, I keep forgetting things. But, yeah. All right, hopefully that's deep enough. See why it's useful to do this before you start filing, because it messes up all of your great precision. Yeah, that's going to be enough. All right. Let's see if they get short again. Yep, just about. All right, now it's notched. So that's all the forging on the bolt. Now it can be, the rest of the bolt can be filed up. And then we could make, there are two other parts that need forging, the spring and the tumbler. And then the other parts are usually cut out, the ward plate and the... So, what should we do at this point? Any other...
Dividers.
Oh yeah, those things. I was hoping we'd forget these completely.
We've got 2 whole minutes.
2 whole minutes. Uh-oh. I was hoping I wasn't going to have to come back for this.
Only 2 left. Light whip.
So all right, pass these around lickety-split. So the object is not to have to file the inside of the slot in order to get the fitting properly. I'm going to touch this up a little. Well, maybe. Maybe I'm going to touch it up a little. Well, let's not touch it up any. All right, so the sort of the modern industrial, all right, we can pass this around lickety-split. I know, the seconds are ticking down.
You probably already addressed this in your filing technique, but it looks like you're like using your file on the out and the
Yeah,
and I was just wondering,
it looks like that, but
you're just so good at it that you're not.
you're still hearing the echo of the outbound stroke. On a bigger surface, I'm filing only on the push stroke, only on the push stroke. When the file isn't trapped inside, or my stroke isn't limited, then I can make the proper full stroke, lift it up on the return. Sometimes when you're filing in, like inside the dividers, and I have a file with no handle, so I only have about that much movement, then I can't get enough. It'll take me forever to. So I cheat in those cases. Usually, I think, well, no one will notice, but so far I've never gotten away with it.
Somebody always reminds you.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. And everyone phrases it in the most supportive way, like, do you have special files that allow you to? Yeah.
Magic 18th century file.
Yeah. Well, I will tell you that my files I use every day, sometimes hours at a time, and I get them to last 3 or 4 months a piece. So I don't feel like I'm spoiling them too fast that way. Well, even the big course ones don't last that long, but these smaller files will last months and months and months of almost everyday use.
Have you ever tried the chemical sharpening?
I tried it a couple of times and I didn't have good results, but I hear that this place called Boggs does a great job. Boggs file sharpening. And you send them a dull file and they charge you $2 and send you a very good sharp file back. It's your own file. They send, I don't know what they do. but quite cheap. They won't sharpen really worn out ones. They have to be not very dull to begin with. But Boggs, B-O-G-G-S.
Use a file card to clean every once in a while?
I don't, because I don't need to. When I file, part of making the file last is by getting it to do a lot, but not more than it can handle. So when a file starts to clog, it's usually because you're trying to take off more than the file is designed for. So if that's the case, you need to get a bigger or coarser file, or expect to take twice as long to do what you're doing. So if you're not overloading the file, they don't tend to clog. And the way I clean them is to whack it on the bench. I have a wooden bench. Well, I don't want to whack it on that, but so I give it a good whack on edge, and after every 2 or 3 strokes, I do that. And I don't ever have to use a file card. In fact, I've been filing, seems like, for weeks here on this lock today. And I bet there's not a file card you can find in this shop in less than an hour. There may be one here, but try to find it, yeah. All right, so the principle here is to assemble these. Since we're making these by hand, we don't want to take an inordinate amount of time precision fitting the joint. That's not the object here. If we're going to precision fit the joint, we would go find a machine that can precision shape the joint. If we're going to do these by hand, we want to come up with a way of crudely fitting the joint, which is efficient by hand. So we were talking yesterday about not adopting modern principles when you're doing hand work because they're inefficient, and this is one of the best examples. Trying to make a perfectly fitted filed mill joint by hand is a waste of effort. If you want a perfectly milled joint, get a milling machine or get a friend with one. What we're going to do instead is make a well-fitted joint without the process of precision fitting. And so we're going to do that by squashing, our favorite non-precision process. So I'm just going to put the two of them together and mash them together. And one of them, or both of them, will conform to each other. They'll fit well. Neither one of them will be precise by itself, but they'll be a precise fit to each other. And so that's why I'm not spending much time filing out the inside of the slot, because that's not the object here. The object is just to get it ready to conform to this one. So when I squash them together, I have a choice. I can get both of them hot, or I could just get one of them hot. And then I have a sub-choice. If I only get one of them hot, I can choose which one. Well, I guess I have another choice. I could go eat. Forget about this. Just give up now while it's safe. So I think it's usually easier to file this one because you're not filing inside a confined space. So this is the one I want the other one to conform to, because I can usually make this a better facsimile of the joint. All right, so here's the other one. Hot, hot, hot. Yep. All right, now they've gone out on a date, but they're not really on their honeymoon yet. So we'll let them think it over for a few seconds. Oops. All right, so now they fit. They fit each other. They're not interchangeable with any other parts, but they don't need to be. So the effort that it would take to make them interchangeable isn't worth it if you're working by hand. If you're working by machine, then it's reasonable. Yeah, oh yeah, so how could they not fit? All right. So to me, that's one of the best it's one of the best examples of 18th century approach to making things and how it differs from the modern industrial approach. Modern approach is to make precise parts, so you have easy assembly. And when you're working by hand, you can't make precise parts quickly, so you make crude parts that assemble well. So it takes some skill in the assembly, but the parts don't have to be perfect.
It's kind of nice for, a shop that doesn't have a lot of tools too.
Sure.
I mean, that's like a great approach.
Yeah. Well, and if I'm going to make 10 of these, it's still faster to make them just like I did than to set up all the tooling, and much less investment. And then the other aspect of this you should think about honestly with yourself is how do you like to spend your time? And if what fascinates you is machining, then it doesn't matter if this isn't necessarily the better way. If you like running a mill and designing tooling, then that's how you ought to do things. But if you say, I want to be a blacksmith, then you should try to make things by forging, not by machining. So part of it is a personality issue and what you think is important. But there are ways to make all these things essentially at the anvil, even the ones that look like they have to have some precision component. And that's the secret of 18th century methods of production, is how do you get things to look precise with the most simple tools there are. Ah.